everybody. Welcome to Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast. Of course, we've got Jonathan Schwartz and obviously Russ with us, Buddy Satella. If you've not listened to our Donovan Morgan interview last week, and tonight we're going to be doing an Antonio Inoki tribute, nearly full show. But
musical.
And Russ brought him to the
musical
show.
tribute.
Our brother from APW, Donovan Morgan, who hasn't talked to any press, hasn't talked to anybody since he left wrestling. What did he say, 2006?
Yeah.
He quit Noah. He walked away. He got married. He moved to Florida. He's got a fantastic business. It's an incredible interview, perhaps one of the best ones we've done, and it's somebody who's not talked to anybody, any world media. So please do yourself a favor, check out our Donovan Morgan interview there. One quick note is UFC former heavyweight champion. I think it was twice champion, and in that and a little lighter division, Daniel Cormier is going to be reffing the cage pit match for that upcoming. I think it's this weekend. But the talk is that he at Mania will then face Brock Lesnar. They didn't get a chance to meet in UFC. Brock left, Cormier retired. It was something all the fans there would want to see. So that will be the exciting attraction match that Antonio Inoki would probably be happy about as Gene LaBelle, his compatriot. This is Antonio Inoki. And I'll try not doing a full monologue and go to you guys. But the importance.
Try, please. Try. Deep down.
All of this stuff. I mean, Antonio Inoki had 9 lives, but his influence globally on wrestling, MMA, boxing, wrestlers becoming politicians like Atsushi Onita, Hiroshi Hase, who followed him, and others.
He might have been the Michael Jordan of Japanese wrestling.
Wasn't Great Sasuke a politician as well? And he actually sat in the Japanese diet under a mask?
So when I worked for him at various points, particularly doing the initial press for the World Wrestling Peace Festival, which was an actual show at the LA Sports Arena in 1996. And I was being flown down there every weekend to work with Inoki, Senator Inoki, and his attorney at the time, Steve Nakata. And Steve Nakata just could not get things done. It was like dealing with Antonio Pena. Everything was last minute. Antonio Pena, the owner, founder of AAA. And that's just, how business is done there. It's not a criticism, but Steve Nakata just had no clue on wrestling or MMA. And it was basically it led to the North Korea thing, which was also a peace festival, the 2-night show there that allegedly drew 300,000. We don't know how many people were paid. The thought is not a lot were paid, but it's still an incredible body of human being, masses seeing on top Inoki against Ric Flair. So there's no, that's huge. So I'm not downplaying that or the Ali thing, which we'll get into, the Ali fight in 76, 20 years prior to that. But the World Wrestling Peace Festival was mixing MMA at that point, which Inoki had championed since it's debatable, it's arguable. Maybe Jonathan has opinions on whether that was the first modern day mixed martial arts match, wrestler Inoki versus Ali. And I have an interesting story for those who know. Bruno Sammartino used to call me nearly every Sunday at about 2 p.m. Pacific time, ask me how WWF business was doing and blah, blah, blah. He didn't always want to hear, he kind of wanted to hear that Vince wasn't doing so well, ratings and pay-per-view wise, etc. But that was, that was their relationship, their dynamic. But he told me, as well as Chris Cruz, some of his other closest friends, many, many times, that initially Inoki came to Bruno with the match. Excuse me, not Inoki, but Ali's people or somebody, monetary people came and Vince Sr. was going to front it at that point. So I'm misspeaking and erring a little bit here, but it was initially for X amount of months going to be, before anybody heard about it, Bruno against Ali, and Vince McMahon just couldn't find the monetary backers. And so then Inoki came into the picture, and he had, quite a few backers, and that would lead to, as I said, Antonio Inoki had 9 lives. Twice he was ousted from New Japan, the company he founded, which is weird, but kind of a little bit of a parallelism to what we saw just 2 months ago with Vince Jr. In WWE. But Inoki had this thing, and between the two guys that were proteges of Ricky Dozan from the JWA, JWF, the initial Japanese wrestling promotion that Fred Blassie, Lou Thez, Dick Destroyer Beyer, the Dusek brothers helped and were the initial talent there helping Ricky Dozan getting that off the ground. But Inoki and Baba were his two prized students. When things kind of went a little bit south around 71, 72, they would split off. Obviously, Inoki, December 72, formed New Japan. And here's where things get interesting. Unlike Baba, who had the traditional NWA backing and he continued using for All Japan, guys like Blassie, King Curtis Iaukea, obviously the Destroyer, who then soon moved there and lived there for 3-4 years, had his TV show, his variety TV show. All of these more theatric pro wrestlers were working for Baba, but Inoki started with Thez and Karl Gotch to lend his new baby, New Japan, credibility, from an athletic standpoint. And, later on, he would add Johnny Valentine, Tiger Jeet Singh, Abdul the Butcher would jump from All Japan, and John Tolis and others. Pat Patterson were regulars at Ernie Ladd for New Japan in its earliest couple of years. But there was, where Baba was beloved, legend, all of that, he couldn't hold the candle to Inoki in terms of in-ring activity and prowess and all of that stuff. And
well, Inoki was such an innovator. He was somebody that really changed the way that Japanese, I think, view wrestling. What are your thoughts about that, Jonathan?
Oh, I agree that the parts that I find most interesting about Inoki's story are the ones that have very little to do with actual in-ring wrestling. I think you go back to the beginning of his career, starting off with Ricky Dozan, who was really the first major Japanese wrestling superstar, and who himself was born in Korea. And
which they really didn't know.
No,
they kayfabe that as they would with
very strongly. Well, again, because at the time, the Japanese public was not necessarily as receptive to the idea of somebody from outside Japan becoming a major star or being a sympathetic figure. But what I find is interesting, because of that really strong personal relationship that he had originally, that's what he was able to leverage into the card with, in North Korea. And he actually, through his political career, went on several missions, across the DMZ into North Korea, in order to try and improve relations between that country and Japan.
Did you read that he allegedly got some held captives out of, was it
Iraq?
Or what other countries? Was it Iraq?
It was Iraq. So that was the other thing. Again, and during his first stint in politics, which coincided with the original Gulf War or thereabouts, he was actually able to go in. There were about 60, somewhere between 64 and 70 Japanese hostages who weren't able to get out in time. And he was able to go in and free, I think, somewhere between 45 and 50 of them. So I've always thought that those stories are probably the most interesting Inoki stories. That kind of just blows by any kind of kayfabe wrestling moment you can think of, just in terms of the sheer guts that it would have taken. And for somebody who came in, Inoki came from a relatively wealthy family, although his father passed away when he was young. And so he had certain advantages coming up, but really the name that he made for himself outside of whatever his accomplishments were inside the ring, and I know we'll get to those in greater depth as well, really even outside of sport itself, I think that's a book in itself, frankly.
There's a book that I want to see. I don't know if I have it, but I was listening to right before the show started to Observer Live, and the Sunday host said there's some kind of book just on the history of New Japan, and I have like one or two, but it's supposedly online somewhere. I don't know if you can just read it, but I want to see about that and hear more of sort of the ups and downs. So that's my shot of Inoki at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles in about 67, 68, memory serves, and he's in the back watching his partner, Seiji Sakaguchi, getting destroyed by one of the heels. I think it was Buddy Killer Austin before Inoki would run in and make the save. That's my earliest photo of Inoki. And let me talk about his history in LA, but I want to get back to Jonathan on like, you know, Inoki died at age 79. I'm trying to confirm this because everybody's reporting he died to the day that he had his very first match in front of people 60 years ago. He debuted in 62. So the claim, I haven't got it fully substantiated, that his very first pro match in front of people was October 1st, 1962. He came in for us. The territory that we want to call them territories, and this Tuesday on Vice is the first episode of Tales from the Territories. I have some photos in a few of them, but they start with the Memphis one. And usually these things, I'm asking a lot of bigwigs. I'm even doing a sort of a think tank this Thursday on the territories, but they're doing it on Memphis, and they're usually, these things are kind of general in nature, maybe to capture casual fans. For us and the Meltzers and those of us, it may not be specific enough. However, if you look at the panel they have there, they have Jerry and Jeff Jarrett, Jerry Lawler, Jimmy Hart, and Dutch Mantell. I don't think you can get better than that to talk about that particular Memphis territory. Goulas, Welch, and then obviously the brain, Jerry Jarrett, who I've got so much respect for. But on Inoki, so Ricky Dozan starts his promotion with the help of those guys that I mentioned. You know, Blassie in particular, he drew records, TV records, like, I don't know what it was, 91% of the viewing audience watched that match, and slightly lower for Ricky Dozan against, this is in Japan, of course. I'm not sure if it was the Sahi network or which one it was.
That also helped make Blassie. I mean, it's one of the long running stories in wrestling, how people died of heart attacks over the brutality of Blassie's matches in Japan.
That was our local heel, but our promotion, which then was the World Wrestling Alliance, the WWA, had a world champion and a world tag team champions, and it was similar to how the AWA formed, and that they claimed that Carpentier, by getting one fall on Thez in a 2 out of 3 where Thez couldn't continue for like the second or third fall, whatever it was, Carpentier was our first world champion. You know, we broke away from the NWA, the LA office, around 1960, 61. And all of those guys were brought in from Los Angeles for Ricky Dozan, who twice they put Booker, Jules Strongbow put the strap on him. And that helped Ricky Dozan get, you know, Jules and the LA office, Booker's, you know, former wrestling legends like Sandor Szabo, along with Thez, who was in the office for a time, helping Jules Strongbow out. They helped Ricky Dozan get that promotion off the ground, and they sent the Duseks and then, you know, later some other talents. And so Inoki, when he came into LA, so I'm going to focus on him as opposed to Baba, who also came regularly to Los Angeles many, many times. In Inoki's case, you know, a year or two might go by, but some years he came 2-3 times a year from like 63 on. But when he came in, Jules Strongbow billed him sadly, and you can't look at it with 2022 eyes. I know that's the thing now with snowflakes, etc. But he was billed kind of racially insensitive as Little Tokyo, not to be confused with the little person midget wrestler who came much later. Or the very first place Inoki's office was in was the ethnic island, the Japanese district of Los Angeles, called Little Tokyo. It was the first office I met him at there. But so he's billed that for his first couple of bouts on our TV and at the Olympic, our big shows, as Little Tokyo. Thankfully, he just got to use his own name thereafter. He was never doing any salt throwing or any of that stuff. He was just a guy who happened to be from Japan, thankfully. The name was horrific, the Little Tokyo name. in hindsight is bad, but that's how he started. And he really came in quite a bit around 1970, and several times that year because he was feuding with John Tolis. But anytime he would come in, whether it was 66, 67, he, as I said on Busted Open last Friday, when I was asked to talk about him, he's inextricably linked with his best friend in wrestling and MMA from a gaijin, non-Japanese sense, in judo, Gene LaBelle, who died, a month ago? And so many of the photos I was sending over to Japan have Gene with Inoki on there. The point of that is Gene, I was one of the several. I wasn't the only one, only ringside photographer in LA. I was one of several. In San Francisco, however, when I'd fly up as Roy Shire's only Cow Palace photographer, that was different. But there, Gene would tell us, we'd seen Gene in the 60s and 70s. He would always say, hey, I'm the one that's picking up Inoki, my pal Tony, as he and others called him, from the airport, whether it was LAX or one of the other airports, typically LAX. But, he said that Antonio taught him Japanese, how to sort of speak that. And we move up in time to the Ali fight. Inoki wanted a conduit, somebody to be the communicator in there. Blassie had sort of been part of the behind-the-scenes booking of how that thing was supposed to go, which, of course, did not go to plan. 1976, Ali Inoki, Judo Gene LaBelle, the referee, handpicked by Inoki to, help things go, and they did not go. As we all know, with the crab kicks to Ali, which inflamed, he had some embolisms and things that developed, and he was never the same after the way that match turned out. And Jonathan may be able to speak about that. But I'm bringing that up because Gene LaBelle, Judo Gene LaBelle, who trained both Ronda Rousey and her mom for the Olympics and in judo, and he helped train her for pro wrestling, as he did Roddy Piper in both. But Inoki counted on Gene to finesse and teach Japanese style to American wrestlers. So many were sent either, from wherever they were starting out of. Say, for example, Stu Hart's top babyface in the 70s, late 60s, 70s, Calgary Stampede territory was the first Dan Crawford, who Jules Strongbow, our booker, renamed King Crow and taught him heel. And then Gene LaBelle taught him New Japan style or Japan style for, to go to work with Inoki. And that's when Inoki would then come in once Gene had his time with these folks. Like another one was Great Kajika. And before he went to the Funks in Amarillo, Gene LaBelle spent a ton of time with him. And both Baba and Inoki would wrestle Kojika, playing heel to their, just regular guy babyface in Los Angeles. And Chris Adams, another judo guy, his very first territory, Inoki sent him to work with Gene in my home base, Los Angeles, my office. And Gene spent all kinds of time with him, as he did with guys he would send Inoki, like Chavo Sr. and Al Madril, to go work for New Japan, but they had to go through, and Inoki counted on Gene to do that. Another one that Inoki sent over a couple of years earlier, before those, was a very clumsy, not so good in the rings, a jobber called Mr. Seiki. And Gene spent a ton of time. So it was the reverse. Inoki would send some of his guys that needed, finessing, green, piss boys, whatever you want to call them, who just were not making it in Japan, and he didn't want to give up on them. So he sent Mr. Seiki there. He job forced for about a year and a half. Gene got him all fixed up, sent him to Leroy McGurk, where he was a tag champion. But later on, we would know Mr. Seiki became Mr. Pogo for all of the hardcore groups, starting with FMW, feuding with Onita and Tarzan Goto, etc. So that is major. And I want to get back, but I want to, because I forgot about this on Busted Open. Inoki, and we'll keep going back to it, he kept, because he was so into martial arts and picked Gene LaBelle's brain on Gene's friendship with Bruce Lee and folks like that, many of the big, Benny the Jet Urquidez and Chuck Norris and all of that stuff, Inoki was keen to ask. Gene about. But you started seeing from about 77 on, and in the 80s, Inoki would bring in from boxing Leon and Michael Spinks, world champions in boxing. And he had Gene LaBelle finesse a judo champion, I think a gold medalist from Holland, Willem Ruska, came and worked in our territory. But, that was to get reps in before Gene, would spend all this time behind the scenes. Nobody knew what Gene was doing with Willem Ruska, really training him. And then he sent him, and he was polished by the time he got to Inoki's New Japan, and he was there for quite a few years, sort of like the counter to Baba's All Japan Anton Giesink, another type MMA guy. But Inoki was way more into MMA and bringing over these guys, even in the 70s, early 80s, and having them lose to him, to build up his legend as this martial arts master. We see that in the late 80s, early 90s with all of these Russian MMA or martial arts and legit Greco-Roman champions. There was quite a few of them that were on the upper levels of the New Japan shows.
Well, before the Inoki Muhammad Ali fight, there'd never really been a mixed martial arts.
Well, that's modern day. There was going back to Greece.
Well, yes, but as far as like to the American public, accepting something like that on a big scale, that changed the way people viewed.
I don't know if that match would suck. I don't know if
it was terrible, but it showed.
I want to ask Jonathan this, but the thing it did for pro wrestling was it was a regular, like every 3 weeks, it was on Wide World of Sports, the promotion leading up to it.
Right.
That was the first time fans were marking out. I did, seeing Vern Gagne with Fred Blassie seconding.
Don't you think it sort of set the seeds for what would become with WrestleMania and having that sort of
it set the seeds for modern day, not 2,000 years ago, pancration, which was martial arts in different disciplines against each other. But no, it led to, here's what I want to say. It led to Inoki had 4 guys that were martial arts masters. And these were the 4 pillars of what would become MMA starting about 1988, 87 with the UWF, the initial UWF group. These guys are Fujiwara, that's where the Fujiwara armbar comes from. Masakatsu Funaki, who founded Pancrase, the promotion, with Ken Shamrock, both Shamrock brothers actually. Akira Maeda rings. He did the shoot kick on Andre about 84 in New Japan. And Nobuhiko Takada, who had UWF 1. But they were all part of this group. Well, they were part of New Japan. Inoki had a hand in training them. And then they all broke away with the original and best Tiger Mask, Satoru Sayama. Now, this is big-time history. They all left. They were all unhappy with being pro wrestlers. And so Sayama, with the help of another legend, the late, great Sammy Sorinaka, starts UWF. And they were, even before any wrestling, so you talk about WrestleMania, they were the first non-baseball event in the Tokyo Dome, the Big Egg Tokyo Dome, starting in like 87. This was before All Japan and New Japan sort of had a combined show where with WWF guys like Randy Savage and DiBiase was.
Yeah, Mike, let Jonathan say something. You haven't been able to let him get a word.
Let me finish my thought here.
You're not going to finish
those 4 pillars of MMA would have their own successful groups. They would lead to Pride. So that's Inoki coming through all of them and they all went back to work for New Japan. All of them eventually, when their promotions kind of fizzled out.
Hey, Jonathan, I'm trying to let you get a chance to get a word.
Let's go back to Jonathan now.
Yes, please. Jonathan, give your thoughts on on the last 20 minutes of what
it's ludicrous to think that had anything to do with WrestleMania, but it was a spectacle. Sadly, the match didn't deliver, but the press for it got the public aware of boxer versus wrestler is what I'm trying to say. Jonathan.
Well, I'd also note that the undercard of that match had a pretty important moment from a boxer and wrestler standpoint, too. You saw Andre the Giant throw Chuck Wepner out of the ring, which I think established a little bit more credibility on the pro wrestling side of things. I think one of the things that's worth noting in the context of the Inoki Ali match itself is that this all took place at a time when the presentation of wrestling, especially in Japan, and until recently, I think this was also more the case in Japan as well, was a lot more serious than it is now. I think for people who are newer to wrestling, you hear New Japan and you're thinking Young Bucks and Kenny Omega and United Empire, and a lot of the really acrobatic, flashy moves that you see today. Back when, as with North American wrestling, but I'd say even more so. I mean, Inoki is best known as the originator of strong style. It was a much more kind of hard-hitting, grinding, submission, hard strike kind of based form of wrestling than what we have today. And I think one of the neat things, when we talk about this as a genesis moment when it comes to MMA, is that it was originally scheduled to be a work. Part of the reason the match fell apart and you wind up with Inoki laying on his back, kicking it at Ali's legs for 12 rounds, is that whatever communication was supposed to happen between the camps ultimately broke down. And so you had, for the first time, what would happen if a catch-as-catch-can wrestler who isn't as inhibited by the same rules as a boxer, still had to stay out of range, wasn't going to go in and shoot on his opponent and take him down, because that just wouldn't be good for business either, but had to keep himself viable in the course of the match. So I've always found that aspect of the contest itself interesting. It's one of the first times for people who are fans of more than one discipline of combat sports, kind of got a preliminary investigation into who could beat who. And that's really kind of been the basis, I think, of MMA going forward. And you see the evolution of it to where, for example, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu becomes the dominant form, or you have Lyoto Machida with his karate skills coming out. And now the pendulum seems to have swung more to just kind of brawlers again. You've got
the Gracies had a lot to do with that swing over to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
But it seems like the pendulum has moved as well too.
Of note, Gene LeBell, I forget what year it was. Was it 56 or 62? He had a match against a boxer who was mouthing off that he could handle any pro wrestler. And Gene kind of destroyed that guy, who was a very famous name boxer. And that was many, many years prior. So we had you want to call it the modern day MMA, Gene in that, Inoki in 76. Gene told me, and a lot of people, there's a book on it. I worked with the guy, as did Meltzer, who did the book, just a book on Inoki versus Ali, complete book on that. But Gene told me, and others might have heard differently, that the finish was that Ali expected Inoki to do the job, quote unquote, and to make it easy, which you kind of look at Rocky III and you see Sylvester Stallone in the Rocky character thinking, we're just going to pitter pat, and Hogan's character there, Thunderlips, was not going along with that program. And Inoki kind of, according to Gene, decided that he didn't want to put Ali over as convincingly, or didn't want to put him over, and then it got to be kind of a mess. And it's sad because it could have led to a lot of things, earlier. And the weird thing was, so initially it was supposed to be Bruno against Ali, and then Vince couldn't find the money for that, and then it went to what it became with Inoki and his backers. But the actual promoter of the thing was Vince McMahon Sr., and Bruno, who has told other people, not just me, on many occasions, that Vince Sr. started getting nervous when he saw that the advance was not great. So he added the Andre Wepner thing, and then he went to Bruno in the hospital bed, and he had a halo on, because Stan Hansen had accidentally, and Stan said he felt terrible. He broke Bruno's neck by accident, but Vince went repeatedly there, and Bruno and his wife both told me they begged Vince to stop asking Bruno to come and have the match there to save the pay-per-view, the show, and that's what happened. So, Hansen had to work very cautiously with Bruno, and Bruno's doctor even several times screamed at Vince Sr., do not make Bruno do this. Mr. Sammartino is in no shape to go and do that. But, Vince said, you got to saved my ass, basically, according to Bruno's wording. This is just Bruno. We don't have Vince Sr. telling us his side. And that's where that match was added on there. And depending on the venues, like at the Cow Palace in San Francisco and LA at the Olympic, my two home bases, they had, before those three big matches on the screen, beamed in, they had local matches, like Chavo against Black Gordman in LA, and there was like a 6-man in San Francisco. Yeah, Jonathan.
So if I can ask a counterfactual question, let's say the original match, Bruno versus Ali, goes ahead. How willing is Bruno to do the job for Ali?
He was...
Bruno defended kayfabe to the bitter end.
Program, as long as it made him look...
He would have done the job probably better than Inoki.
But as long as he did not look weak coming out of it, I think Bruno would have been amenable. Not a clean knockout or anything like that, but maybe counted out of the ring or some kind of goof, typical pro wrestling thing where he gets hit with a punch. Maybe he's outside.
The ref gets hit with a punch.
Yeah, I think he was a businessman, whereas, I don't know. It would have been fun, and Ali was a huge mark. I think that's where it came from. He was a huge. We know he was obviously he, like others, like John Waters, a director, like Bob Dylan said, Gorgeous George was a huge influence on them, and Ali obviously doing his shtick, his promos, admitted to stealing all that stuff, lifting it initially from his idol, Gorgeous George, after seeing him at the Louisville Gardens or Coliseum, whatever year that was, 1960. But he was also a fan and close with Blassie and a fan of Bruno. And, Blassie at that point had left our home base, LA, took Vince Sr.'s offer.
And there's also that incident with Gorilla Monsoon. And
it's not an incident. It was just part of the angle to get the fight over. So when we had Vern and Blassie in the ring at the same time, which was a dream for many of us, just was, with Buddy Wolf facing off against, against Ali on Wide World of Sports. And a couple of weeks later, they're in WWF territory as opposed to Chicago where the Vern and Blassie thing happened. So that's where the thing with Monsoon and the airplane spin and blah, blah, blah with Ali. And that was brilliant and fun too. But this thing was being promoted on Wide World of Sports with that legendary announcer that every Saturday show a lot of us miss, that would, treat pro wrestling seriously. We had very little pro wrestling on any kind of media. When Andre went on the Tonight Show, sadly, Johnny Carson was not on that night, and Mike Douglas was a replacement. But for example, last Friday, I was tooting this all over the place. Nobody heard or watched the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. He had Debbie Harry on. She's plugging a box set, and in her box set of Blondie's Career is a framed ring wrestling magazine with her on the cover backstage with Andre. And they list the different wrestlers in the article, and Antonio Inoki is listed on there inside the magazine. So that is in her box set being sold around the world. And they talked about that, and she claimed that one of her best friends did PR for Vince Sr. and gave her free tickets. She said she went to hundreds of WWF shows, most specifically the MSG shows, and she talked about, so we didn't have a lot of, in the 70s, wrestling just, that's why you barely would admit that you were a wrestling fan in the 60s or 70s. It did not have any of that clout. It didn't, since Gorgeous George was butting around with Bob Hope and Jack Benny, and he was on the Jack Benny show twice, etc. But that was in the 50s, early 50s when TV started, and we had nothing. Then Andre started hitting it, and later on Hogan. Now it's commonplace for all of today's fans seeing, Triple H or The Rock or Cena on all of the late night talk shows, the morning shows, the Kelly Ripa stuff. But we didn't have.
Cena's actually done a job hosting a few of those.
Yeah, on the Today Show.
Cena's done a semi-regular spot on the Today Show. He filled in for Ellen DeGeneres on her show a couple of times.
Yeah, The Rock was on with Ellen DeGeneres. That was a go-to show for pro wrestlers, and both of those guys, unlike any other actor, and them coming from pro wrestling, they work hardest. They are on like all of the American talk shows. Jimmy Kimmel and Seth Meyers.
And we remember Cena when he goes back to being the prototype with XPW down in Los Angeles.
But that was not when he was famous. And I shot.
No, it was a much different. He was still a nice guy, though, having met him during the APW, UPW invasion stuff that happened in the early 2000s.
Back to, because I don't think Jonathan was done with Ali Inoki. Jonathan, what did you hear or read if you're doing a little prep? What was the supposed finish supposed to be? Because Inoki and his people wouldn't have gone with that because they were hoping to do more events like that. That it would have gone, cleanly. So was it Ali or was it Inoki who balked? And I think it was Ali when he found out that he was being asked, I guess, last minute to put Inoki over. He wasn't going for it because he thought, obviously, the bigger name. Nobody knew, outside of those of us in pro wrestling. And they did a lot of prep. Inoki did a lot of prepping at the Olympic when the fans weren't there at the Olympic Auditorium because the gym was the ring was almost permanently there, used for both boxing and wrestling. But all kinds of stuff during the day when fans weren't allowed in. And, obviously Ali shot some promos that were in LA that were beamed back to Japan and used for that. But it was just a shame. Well, let me see what Jonathan thinks. It was a shame that bout was not better because we could have had, a lot earlier stuff. Again, Inoki, his presence leading through to arguably the greatest MMA promotion, not UFC, but Pride. Everybody talks about Pride. I've shot some of that stuff, and it was incredible. And it fizzled out. There, was another kind of an issue, but UFC picked up and bought all of that, and then never released it. They bought it sort of like Vince buying WCW for the content, the TV, the video, the pay-per-views, and then not putting that intellectual property out there for fans to see or selling it. It's kind of weird. You also look very quickly, I don't want to forget this, that Inoki, his style coming to the ring in a beautiful, fantastic robe with a towel draped underneath it, that came from Lou Thesz. He was a huge Lou Thesz mark. Lou Thesz, in his championship years, his 6 times as NWA World Champion, did that. Inoki passed that on to Tatsumi Fujinami, Dragon, who did the same. That's a given. And I asked Fujinami about that directly, who passed
Okada does it now.
Okada now. So that lineage, Thesz, Inoki, Dragon to Okada, that's impressive. And there are so many spheres of positive influence beyond the fact that, well, anyway, Jonathan, were you finished with Ali Inoki? Let me let you give some.
Well, so the two things that I always wonder, first off, my sense of it was not even that Ali would have objected to, the one thing that's always kind of not quite made sense to me about it is, as we've all noted, and pretty much anybody who follows wrestling for any length of time understands, Ali was a huge fan. And we've name-checked Gorgeous George, we've name-checked Fred Blassley. He understood the art form of it, as it were. And he was one of the first to kind of bring that kind of showmanship outside of the ring into a different ring, but with the patter and the promos and everything. And he basically appropriated that and basically set the template for a lot of what modern entertainment is, even if you go into other sports.
Trash
beyond
talk,
that.
I think
Absolutely. I mean, Michael Jordan picked up where Ali left off in terms of trash talk. But I think part of it was not quite the two sides not being able to come to an agreement on how best to make the other one look good in their respective discipline without themselves looking weak in their own. And I think that's always a bit of a challenge. The other thing that match has kind of always left me with is a question, really, and frankly, it's trailed into boxing and it's trailed into modern MMA too, is to what extent those matches are, if not outright predetermined, but parts of them are. And I think that there's always allegations against fighters throwing fights. There's always within MMA questions about, of whether a fighter is just kind of toying with their opponent or letting them bout go to extra rounds to appeal to bettors, that kind of thing. But I think that's, if from a wrestling standpoint, one of the key things is always being able for fans to suspend our disbelief. I think that's always kind of left that question there. And in a wrestling context, I think it's a good thing whenever we can kind of suspend our disbelief and wonder, well, maybe this time they're actually fighting. I remember that Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels 1997 Survivor Series match, which started with a brawl in the aisles. Forget what the finish of that match was. But I know, for example, there's been MMA fights where you just kind of have to wonder, based on the flow of the fight, what exactly is happening. There was a Bellator fight a couple of years ago. It was Ken Shamrock versus Tito Ortiz. Both men, at least from an actual MMA standpoint, I would argue were somewhat past their primes.
Definitely past their prime then.
And
because they feuded in UFC when they
yeah.
were far younger, but Ken was even long in the tooth then.
Yeah, but Ken Shamrock is an animal, and he basically swarmed Tito Ortiz for the first portion of the match. And then out of nowhere, he just kind of lets up, and there's no indication that he's injured, but he basically lets Tito get his back out of nowhere. And the fight gets finished shortly thereafter. And every now and then you would see a fight where it seems like there's just enough daylight that you question whether what's happening is on the up and up. And I think the same way as we're drawing a through line to MMA in its most positive aspects, I think if you look at the interplay, especially on the Japanese side, between pro wrestling and how wrestling works, and you think of how strong those original, the Lou Theszes, the Carl Gotches, as you'd mentioned, were in the presentation of their wrestling. Again, I think it's interesting I think it's an interesting question as to how much of it actually is, you don't know who's going to win beforehand, and how much of it isn't scripted the way wrestling here is, but how much of it, what happens behind the scenes and what goes into a good fight versus just a slugfest or somebody putting somebody to sleep in 3 minutes.
Because Gene said when he came out of those meetings, he had a good feeling that both would cooperate for the betterment or a big box office and potential future matches. And both of these guys, Inoki, Ali, were great businessmen. Mm-hmm. Well, you could argue that sometimes Inoki, it was more about himself than doing what was right for his own company he founded, and that got him into problems. The whole Inoki has 9 lives thing, and we're still celebrating Inoki's life because there is no replacing Antonio, the octopus Inoki at all.
Yeah,
to say, this isn't to be negative about it at all. This is just to kind of be clear. We think about boxing or MMA or pro wrestling as very different things. And I sometimes wonder whether the magic in them and what makes them, what makes us want to keep tuning into them and what makes them so compulsively watchable is the fact that each of these disciplines borrows a little bit from the other. And ultimately, North American pro wrestling, I would argue, is primarily storyline driven, whether it's what goes on in the ring or the soap opera antics that go on outside of it. I think that some of the same principles apply in these other cases, and we can see, particularly through Inoki's career, the evolution of that side of things, both in terms of just the athleticism that's involved and the hard-hitting action that's involved, and how you get to matches that are worth seeing. And I think that both are ultimately positive.
Like Russ, I guess, and Russ wants to talk. I almost demanded Russ watch that New Japan on Thursday. It was the full show, Okada Ospreay. That was an incredible match. Mm-hmm. Incredible. I mean, those of you who watched it on New Japan World probably saw a more complete version. But this was a damn good match. So, Russ, you were going to say something.
Well, I wanted to go back to Inoki because I wanted we haven't, when we've talked about a tribute about him, we've never talked about maybe what you guys thought was his greatest match.
There is no single greatest match. There were many. Let me throw this great point, because look at him before New Japan or All Japan started in JWA/JWF. The best matches, and I saw them all over video stores in not just Tokyo when I went over there many times. Inoki versus Story Jr., Inoki versus Jack Briscoe, and Inoki versus Billy Robinson, like 1970 or before, 69. Those are incredible matches. I do not want to forget. Let me tell you the history of the IWGP Championship and the Tag Championship, because very briefly, this is what happened. They didn't really have any titles when New Japan started, and Johnny Powers was NWF champion. That was his promotion in parts of Ohio, Buffalo, partnering and co-booking with Pedro Martinez, who was an infamously cheap, allegedly, booker. Well, no, he admitted it to me himself that he stiffed some guys. But that was a promotion that ran from about 1970 through 74-ish, early 74. It was sadly going downhill, but they did a lot of great things when it was happening. And Johnny Powers kind of looked like a Jack Briscoe, good-looking guy. He was the world champion, but the boss of it. He, when it was going downhill, he agreed to sell both the singles and the tag straps to Inoki. So he goes over there to New Japan and drops the NWF title. That was later renamed the IWGP Championship. The tag titles were dropped by two guys who never teamed at all. So Inoki wanted, by that point he was already using Johnny Powers regularly, and Pat Patterson had just started touring. So the original tag champs of Von Hess and Von Schatz were not recognized at that point by New Japan. And so Inoki has Pat and Johnny Powers, and I talked to both of them and then posed them at the 2000 CAC together, where they both said, yeah, we had never teamed before, had not met, oddly. They didn't work in the same territories, because other than Ohio, Johnny Powers most famously worked in the early 60s for Vern Gagne. So at the Olympic Auditorium in LA, Inoki asked and had it taped for Japan. So that was our main event, with Joe Louis oddly reffing. Pat Patterson, Johnny Powers dropping 2 out of 3 to Inoki and Sakaguchi. The NWF, what Inoki asked ring announcer Jimmy Lennon Sr. to call the International World Tag Team Championships. So Inoki and Sakaguchi get it. That is also renamed the IWGP Tag Team Championships, and they remain that to this day. Blended into the IWGP Championship was Riki Choshu's Greatest 18 Club title, sort of like the Triple Crown in All Japan, where the United National Championship was merged with the PWF and I forget the other championship into that All Japan title. Something else interesting is, as I told you, that after he was billed as Little Tokyo in LA, then oddly Jules Strongwood said, okay, we can bill you by your given name of Kanji Inoki. So a couple of matches in 64, 65 in Los Angeles, he's billed as Kanji Inoki, but not from Japan, but from Brazil, which is, when you think about that, that was something Japan was not admitting either. That, he was a Japanese person, but born there, allegedly. Most people believe he was born in Brazil. And that's where a lot of his backers came from. His rise and different falls in New Japan were these Brazilian monetary guys, etc. And also, right off the top of my head, I also misspoke, because boxers who had boxer versus wrestler matches included Primo Carnera, who was a boxing world champion, heavyweight champion. He later, when he couldn't box anymore, he became a pro wrestler. Jersey Joe Walcott and Joe Louis had boxer versus wrestler matches, way before what we were talking about here in Ali Inoki. And then when they could no longer do that, once their boxing careers were over, they did a few mixed matches. They became longtime special referees. As I mentioned in this tag team championship, Inoki wanted for his TV somebody to, again, like Thez and Gotch, give him that credibility pre-Ali in Joe Louis, who was the most
Jonathan, do you have a favorite match of Inoki's, of yours, you'd like to talk about?
Or favorites. There were so many. You can't just name one.
I would have gone with Funk or Briscoe. I think we would be remiss if we didn't get into one of the all-time most infamous shoot moments in wrestling history, being Inoki's match with the great Antonio.
Yeah, from Montreal, who I think the Vachons, didn't they train him? And that's where the first
train in a very loose sense of the word.
Yes, yeah.
Antonio was in his own right a very eccentric character, and unfortunately really took a bit of a legitimate beating at Inoki's hands in that match and was never the same, and wound up towards the end of his life on the streets of Montreal.
He was the first, though. That's where the very first Mabel story, if you talk to Paul Vachon now, that's where it originated. It's had a bunch of incarnations elsewhere, but the first Mabel with the husband
did not work on Pat Patterson.
I'm sorry?
Did not work on Pat Patterson, though.
No, did not work. Although Pat Patterson, here's a funny story that both Pat and Ann Calvello, who roller derby's heel in the Jerry Seltzer, really the true international roller derby. She purposely said, I'm going to skate in my seventh decade to equal Lou Thez. She was friends with all the boys. She was very close to Ray Stevens, Pat, Nick Bockwinkel, and the fourth man of their four musketeers, Bockwinkel, Heenan, Ray, Pat, and Nick. So there might have been 5 musketeers. So they're in Honolulu before Jerry Seltzer, another San Francisco, Oakland guy, Russ, who owned, and he was very good friends with Roy Shire. So there was a lot of parallelisms. So the global roller derby with the San Francisco area. Anyway, they both had crisscrossing tours in 1973 in Honolulu, and they're over there at the same time. And basically, Ray and Annie Calvello, Banana Nose Calvello, who used to co-host my TV show for about 3 years back in the 90s, what a legend she was. This was a person who would wear Chanel No. 5, but she put on so much of it, you would just get near her, not even hug her, and you would smell like her Chanel for days. Anyway, they get Pat drunk, and I guess Annie put a Mickey in his drink. You know, they're out club hopping in Oahu, Honolulu, and they put Pat to bed, and then Ray and Heenan and Nick put Pat in bed with Ann, or no, put Ann in bed with Pat. And Pat wakes up, he sees Ann there, and he told the story forever that was the one and only female he ever slept with. And he said that with a smile on his face, because everybody loved Ann. You know, she was considered the fabulous moolah of roller derby. Fantastic promo artist, great athletically, really one of the superstars like Joni Weston and Charlie O'Connell, those Thezes of roller derby. And that is just so heartwarming. But you talk about Inoki's matches. So the matches with John Tolis and Dan King Crow Crawford, Stu Hart's guy again, in 1970 Los Angeles.
What about the ones against Flair?
Well, there was just the one in Korea, to my knowledge.
Yes.
There might be some others when Flair did some tours, but Flair predominantly, actually no, Flair toured for All Japan.
Flair dropped the belt. Sorry, it wasn't Flair. I think it was Harley Race dropped, and Briscoe dropped the belt to Baba at various points.
Well, those were monetary deals. Those were a bit different than the Backlund to Inoki deal. And what a big deal that was for the announcers to say that on SmackDown Friday. Yeah. That was huge. I was asked at length that when I'm talking with Tommy Dreamer on Saturday on Busted Open. That was huge. But that was, maybe it was a monetary thing. Baba's things were straight out. Twice he had Harley Race drop to him and win it back within a matter of days. And I was at the December 74, Jack Briscoe dropping to Baba and getting the title back like 8 days later, December 74, which is a huge deal because Munchnick and the Funks and Harley all purposely went on that tour. Not so much as policemen because Baba was easygoing, but he apparently paid the NWA office. And also, I guess that was the same with Rick Martel dropping it briefly to Jumbo Tsuruta, that particular title to, as a favor to Baba to get Jumbo over. So it was 2 Harley, 1 Jack Briscoe to Baba himself, which was kind of weird because they weren't really talked about. Definitely, really was hardly talked about at all, like the Jack Veneno Flair thing, which was more out of necessity, I guess, to get Flair out of there alive. And
I mentioned all of this in my column last week, by the way.
Oh, will you send me a link?
I will. The subject was basically looking at the shows in Saudi Arabia and the weird stuff that tends to happen there and how it gets quickly retconned out of existence, as though Saudi Arabia has replaced Canada as WWE's idea of Bizarro World. And you see all kinds of strange happenings, random title changes like Bill Goldberg beating Bray Wyatt a couple of years back. Braun Strowman winning Royal Rumble that never seemed to really exist. Basically, odd happenings like that, and comparing them to these phantom title changes, Inoki and Backlund being probably the biggest that I can think of, and the most recent being since
then there'd be Flair Harley race in Singapore is weird too. Although
Flair and Race were both NWA guys and North American NWA guys, this is more kind of Veneno was a great example. Flair dropped the title to Carlos Colon as well and Victor Jovica under very similar.
Sorry? In Puerto Rico?
It's a WWC thing, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, Colon definitely was. I think Jovica was in Trinidad, I think.
And what happened? Then they just handed him the belt back, because I was backstage at Flair Fujinami, March 21st, 1991.
Well, that was the last example.
Yeah, that was weird because I was there. If you look at it's on WWE Network. I was the only Gaijin foreigner shooting ringside. The rest of the 19 guys were only allowed 20. 19 were Japanese. One was me, this white guy with a mustache. But backstage at that, so Fujinami won clean. There's nothing, no schmoz, no mess, no whatever. And Flair puts the strap around him backstage. I shot all the photos of Flair putting that. So he's wearing that atop his IWGP, because it was title versus title. And then the way idiotic Jim Hurd, the ice cream man, who was the boss of WCW at the time, they then said that the match was held up, and they gave some kind of lame excuse, but that's not how it was. It was clean. All the newspapers reported it clean. We saw it as clean. We had the victory party. I shot Flair with Fujinami and his wife, and Flair's holding up Inoki's daughter, Fujinami's young daughter there. Everybody all smiles at the after party at the Keo Plaza Hotel. So that was just fictitious once it got back to LA, and I guess kind of how.
So guys, we're gonna have to wrap it up. What do you think the lasting legacy of Antonio Inoki is for wrestling's history?
Jonathan.
I think his legacy runs across any number of streams. I think the impact that he had on mixed martial arts and popularizing that basically across 2 continents is unbelievable. I think NJPW is his legacy right now. If you look at the hottest acts in wrestling today, they've all filtered through there. Everyone from the Bucks to AJ Styles to Okada, you can basically draw a line to pretty much every major promotion, and you can see the impact both in terms of the style and presentation of wrestling, the fact that there's been this turn to more incredibly athletic wrestling and yet more serious presentation as well, I think kind of filters back through the same thing. You look at the impacts that he had politically, and for somebody who, just from my perspectives as somebody who's worked in that arena before, quite outside of wrestling, obviously, he prefigured guys like Jesse Ventura, for example. In terms of the impact that somebody who's coming from this field of entertainment that many people aren't necessarily at first likely to take as seriously, I think he punched way above his weight on any number of fronts.
And I'll just briefly say, absolutely incredible. He lived several lives because he was so diversified. One match that you guys should see, I want to throw out there, is him against Masa Saito on an island, a pit island. Senator Inoki, Antonio Kanji Inoki, against Hansen, Brody. There's any number of, whether it's brawling or, what Inoki kind of popularized, that martial arts, the other disciplines to make a more well-rounded wrestler that we still see today. You see it in Will Ospreay, Kenny Omega, all of the greatest Japanese guys, Okada obviously, and just so many. And yet, like Inoki, New Japan has had births and deaths and rebirths. Now they're in perhaps their greatest period. You have to thank him and MMA, from Pride to UFC to current, the Bellator, the competitor, the lead competitor at UFC, and everything that Inoki did. And there is no replacing him. He had so much influence in so many different spheres that Japan is in mourning right now, and we are too for Antonio Inoki.
First the Queen, and now this. What
do you know?
Jonathan,
I think more important still.
Why don't you give out your contact information and plug Slam Wrestling?
And big column. He just did a big column that I want to read now.
So, as usual, my column runs every 2 weeks. It's coming up this coming Sunday on slamwrestling.net. I still have to figure out what I'm going to write about, but I'm sure there'll be no end of material to work with. I did want to mention one thing. I'm not sure if you would have caught it, but I think outside the world of wrestling, there are infinitely more important things as well. I don't know if you caught this past Friday's SmackDown, but particularly Ronda Rousey's match. So SmackDown this past Friday took place in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, next province over from me here in Toronto, Ontario. And I don't know if the audience would have caught it, but Ronda Rousey was wearing an orange T-shirt. The significance of that T-shirt, apart from the fact that it's not a WWE licensed thing, is that she wore it in honor of our National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, which is basically a new annual, I won't say holiday, but a day to commemorate the lasting effects of Canada's residential schools on our Indigenous population. These schools ran from the beginning of Confederation, when Canada became a country in 1867, and the last one only shut down in 1996. And unfortunately, they're part of a very difficult and challenging legacy that many of us are only just becoming aware of. Over the last couple of years, on the site of many of these schools, they've uncovered a number of mass graves. And just kind of understanding what the nature of our relationship has been with our Aboriginal communities, with our Indigenous communities, is something that a lot of us are still working to comprehend, and something that we are all trying to do better at. So I just wanted, not that I don't know whether she watches the program or not, but I did want to give Miss Rousey a shout out, because that was.
We'll pass it on to her.
More power to her. Has she done any social media or press, saying specifically why she wore the shirt? Did she bring it up at all?
I hadn't noticed that she had, but I think it's one. But I've noticed on a couple of occasions that she has used the platform that she has to kind of send messages out to people who would be in the know. For example, a couple of weeks ago, she wore the pink Jean Labelle gi.
Right.
So I think,
her clothing is doing her talking.
Yeah, I think when one has a platform the way that she and other wrestlers often do, I feel the same way when, in the wake of what happened with George Floyd, you saw a number of talent wearing Black Lives Matter shirts as well, or armbands or that kind of thing. I just think it's important to call out and support when that happens.
Definitely. Right. And the fact that besides the first names coming back to WWE wrestlers under Hunter's regime, another talent, obviously not Bryan Danielson, he's not there, did the gene. They called it the Labelle Lock. I think that was either last Monday or last Friday on WWE TV. That was impressive, because they had ceased being allowed that to be called, and now everything seems to be more normalized, and that's why WWE programming is, you can't miss it, as you can't miss AEW or Impact, etc. So, Russ,
Jonathan, thank you so much for being on the show. this
Thank
week.
you for having me.
You can be found on Slam Magazine. What's the address again?
Slamwrestling.net. My column is Wrestler's Court with Jonathan Schwartz. It usually runs every other Sunday. I am looking forward in the next little while. AEW is going to be coming to Toronto October, I want to say 12th and 13th, or 13th and 14th.
Are you gonna go?
I plan on being there. I know.
Maybe we'll have you on after the show.
Well, of course, he'll come on, and we'll have him talk about.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what your
his experience, because it sounds like it's joyous fun. You know, a lot of fun to be wrestling.
We'll find out.
Oh,
it'll be my first outing like that since COVID, so I'm very excited.
Wow. All right, guys, we got to go.
Well, before you forget, on Slam's Inoki Tribute, Greg Oliver, the editor, put 3 of my Inoki shots that he had me send. So they should
go.
Don't forget to go sign my
All right, guys. See you again soon. Good night.
Good night, guys.